In Narrowsburg, upstate New York, a barren patch of land offers hints to a tragic story.
Neighbors were waking up to, in the dark, seeing this glow in the distance. Some people thought it was a sunrise.
It wasn't. It was the light from the growing flames of a home ablaze. Inside, a woman, dead.
So you knew the house was on fire?
Yes.
Did he say how he strangled her?
Caught up in a murder story, Scott Sherwood, friend and colleague to Paul Novak.
Paul Novak paid him to drive him upstate to kill his wife.
Something Paul Novak denied as he feigned innocence.
They told me that, at that point, they told me that a body was found there, but they weren't sure if it was Catherine's or not.
She had been found lying on the basement floor on her back with her arms outstretched. She had been crushed at some point by falling debris when the house collapsed in the fire.
Catherine Novak, mother of 2 small children, murdered, and her friends suspect foul play.
I immediately thought, oh my God, she was murdered.
Who was responsible for a brutal killing in an American backwater? Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Paul Novak as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Catherine and Paul Novak were part of a high-octane world of New York paramedics. That was where their relationship would begin.
Paul Novak met Catherine in the summer of 1996 at an ambulance corps barbecue.
Emergency medical technicians, or EMTs, form close bonds. A decade later, Paul Novak would keep a conspiracy to murder in the EMT family as he enlisted the help of colleagues to end Catherine's life. He got a girlfriend to help him. Her name, Michelle LaFrance.
What is he telling you that he wants to do, or how does that come about?
That he was going to kill Catherine.
And he says that to you?
He got the chance to enlist the help of those who might be able to provide a little muscle too, like Scott Sherwood.
They were on an ambulance together as paramedics. I mean, you have a lot of downtime. They talked a lot.
Why did he do this to Catherine?
No, he said it to me because I don't want to end up like you.
He manipulated someone into helping him commit a heinous crime, and without even caring one whit, as far as I'm concerned, about what happened to Scott.
Catherine Novak was most happy when living the life of a homemaker. After a tough childhood, she craved nothing more than stability, and her work would pay for that.
She worked really hard to get where she wanted to be in life, so she worked odd jobs to be able to get the money that she needed to go to college and to complete her EMT training that she wanted to do as well.
She joined the ambulance service in Queens, where she worked first as a dispatcher, then as a first responder.
She was a very unusual type because of her sense of civic duty, her willingness to plunge in, donate her time to her church, to her community, to the school.
Paul, on the other hand, was a thrill seeker. He was always broke too, blowing his income on electronics and fast bikes.
He tended to spend his money on electronics and was perpetually fixing up motorcycles that he would then race around in the woods in upstate New York at 160 miles an hour.
He was tall and strong, an imposing figure well known in the Jamaica Hospital ambulance service where he worked. He reveled in his identity as a community crusader, saving lives night after night.
In those days, right after 9/11 and at the very early years of the Iraq War, anyone with a paramedic uniform on from New York, you kind of assumed might have been a hero.
He prided himself on his ability to bring victims of heart attacks and road accidents back from the dead. Some of those who knew him suspected that Paul got a kick out of having the power to save lives and pronounce death, to appear the hero. Catherine, though, she just cared about the patients.
Catherine and Paul were different, very different.
None of their co-workers could understand the attraction between them.
I think Paul Novak only cared about Paul Novak.
On the surface, it didn't seem like their relationship would really work. But she loved him, and on Valentine's Day 1997, the two were married.
She obviously sees the good in him, to the point where she's willing to ignore any signs, any bad things that maybe, kind of any red flags that maybe came up in the relationship.
If Catherine thought she'd found her Prince Charming, she was very much mistaken. Paul was a man who was deeply flawed. He was somebody who would always be looking for the next thrill, the next high, the next woman, the next porn site that he would access, even when sitting in his ambulance.
And the behavior of Paul Novak within that community of paramedics, the adrenaline rush, the drug use, the porn addiction, all of it very dark, that was eye-popping.
Paul Novak had the ability to do terrible things and not have a conscience about it.
When Catherine Lane became Catherine Novak, she perhaps thought Paul would change. It was a vain hope.
It's kind of a rocky start throughout the first year of marriage, because then Paul Novak, he applies for bankruptcy.
Despite his steady job, he had wild spending habits which outweighed his salary. Catherine clung to the idea that becoming a family man would change him. They had 2 children, first a little girl, then 4 years later, a boy. And in pursuit of the kind of childhood that she had never had, they moved their young family out of Queens.
Within a few years of getting married, the couple had bought a house in Narrowsburg, New York, a tiny farming community that was outside of the city.
Narrowsburg is a small, slightly run-down town of around 100 families 2 hours northwest of New York City. It lies in a secluded spot on the eastern banks of the Delaware River.
Catherine had bought a house in the rural area outside of Narrowsburg, and it was a simple house, a little red and white house.
Catherine was determined to raise her children somewhere safe, quiet, somewhere with a real sense of community, a world away from the bright lights, noise and anonymity of New York City.
She had always wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. Her mother later said that she was the kind of person who wanted her children to look back on their house and say, that's the house that I grew up in.
She believes that she's starting this new life in a small town, and it's going to be bliss.
Journalist and writer Nina Burley befriended Catherine when she moved to the town.
I met Catherine when both of our children were 5-year-old kindergartners at the Narrowsburg school, and she was just a mother, just like me. We both had 5-year-olds and a toddler, and we got to know each other at the school. Every day we were dealing with the same things as mothers of our first child going to school. And she was a lovely person. She was a great mother.
She's got this perfect life, and she's married, in her mind, the perfect man as well, who's also saving lives. What could go wrong?
Narrowsburg turned out to be far from a safe haven for Catherine Novak.
It's a place where things can happen because it's a rural community, and you're far from neighbors, you're far from the authorities, and on a dark night, a lot of things can happen if you have somebody with malign intent.
Very early on, there were signs for Catherine that leaving the city had not meant leaving her problems behind. Paul insisted on keeping his job in New York, but he couldn't face the 4-hour daily commute to and from Narrowsburg.
Paul still worked in Queens, so he would sleep several nights a week in an apartment in Queens while Catherine stayed up in Narrowsburg with their new daughter.
Her husband wasn't here very often. Her husband was a paramedic in New York, and he would show up on occasion to the morning drop-off wearing his uniform.
Paul refused to embrace rural life. When he was around, he made no effort to get to know his family's new friends and neighbors.
Her husband was kind of a quiet guy. I didn't really talk to him very much, a burly man who often showed up again in a uniform. And I didn't really get to know him because he wasn't around very often.
Her friends described him as antisocial and a little bit creepy, but Catherine was willing to make excuses for him.
Catherine, on the other hand, thrived in her new environment.
She sometimes babysat for my kids. I would bring my son over to play with her daughter, and our toddlers would play together. And she was also somebody who volunteered a lot. She was donating her time to the school and making cupcakes and chaperoning children.
She was a deacon in the local Lutheran church. She led her daughter's Girl Scout troop.
She helped out with the church, she helped out with the school.
She was almost a semi-professional volunteer.
Meanwhile, most of the time, Paul was 120 miles away, living a bachelor existence, free to indulge his worst excesses. It was much easier at this distance to keep his flaws a secret from his devoted wife.
The real Paul Novak was cold, not social, had a porn addiction, was reckless in the extreme, was an adrenaline addict, as many EMTs will admit that they are.
Meeting other women in the EMT Corps too, and telling them his side of a story of marital rows, one which was not even close to the truth.
He had me convinced that Catherine was the bad guy and he was the good parent, and these kids are abused and these kids are miserable.
We do this for the kids.
And we need to save the kids.
How long would it take before Paul Novak's behavior in the city would spill over into his quiet rural home life in upstate New York? In 2007, paramedic Paul Novak was living a high-stress, adrenaline-fueled existence. It was a lifestyle that inevitably took its toll.
In one night, a New York City paramedic might deal with 50 heart attacks. I mean, it's an incredible job that they have to do, and clearly it has an effect on their mental health.
Theirs was a tight-knit community of hard-working EMTs who'd seen it all. Paul Novak himself would idle in his ambulance outside buildings that he knew had good Wi-Fi, so that he could download hardcore pornography whilst on duty. It didn't seem to cross anybody's mind to blow the whistle when colleagues misbehaved. They even turned a blind eye when, out of the blue, Paul Novak began discussing how to commit the perfect murder.
He had been talking about researching the perfect crime, how to hide a body, had left a trail of crumbs about his guilt before the murder happened.
He was researching things on the internet. He was researching chloroform. You know, he was going to go and he was looking into how he could do this and get away.
All of these EMTs in his station were aware of different facets of this malignant intent. And incredibly, not one of them picked up the phone and called the police.
Around this time, Paul became increasingly bitter about his marriage, complaining that when he was at home, Catherine didn't pay him enough attention.
Paul might have felt like he was playing second fiddle to some degree to Catherine's duties.
She's becoming this amazing individual in this small town community, and Paul Novak is now feeling very insecure about who he is as a person. He feels like he's low man compared to his wife.
He became resentful of the commute back to Narrowsburg, interested in other women too. Co-workers would later testify that he mused about ways to get rid of his wife. He told one colleague that fire was the best way to kill someone because it burned all of the evidence.
Was cold and calculating and had been talking to his fellow paramedics about how much he didn't like his wife, how happy he would be if he could get rid of her.
Somebody overheard him say to his wife, "You may be the mother of my children, but I can still kill you."
At first dismissed as a joke, some of Paul's medic friends have since wondered if he was vetting them, gauging their willingness to help him dispatch Catherine Novak for good. Indeed, one of them took the bait. Scott Sherwood, a friend and co-worker who had recently been through a tough divorce, leaving him low on money and on self-esteem. His lawyer, Ben Greenwald, believes Novak targeted his vulnerable client.
What could cause such a nice person to do bad things? I think in this case, it's less looking at Scott Sherwood and more looking at Paul Novak's ability to manipulate.
Back in 2007, Catherine Novak was completely in the dark about her husband's sinister intentions. He made a point of looking like he was trying to make a go of things.
The marriage was in trouble, or at least it seemed to be to Catherine's friends. But on Valentine's Day 2007, 10 years after they first got married, the couple decided to renew their vows.
Catherine's friends recall how happy she was about this. She said it meant a lot to Paul that he wanted a fresh start for their struggling marriage. Her friends wanted to believe this was the case, but they all thought he was simply doing it to keep his wife sweet.
Not long after that, however, Paul took out a life insurance policy on Catherine. And it seemed a bit weird to her friends, but she defended it as a good decision for their children and their family, just looking out for the best interests of their family.
The attempt to paper over the cracks in their marriage didn't last long. Later that year, Paul told Catherine that he didn't love her, that perhaps he never had. His visits to Narrowsburg became less frequent, and when he was there, he slept in the guest bedroom.
Even the times that I would maybe drop off a kid at her house or interact with her at her house, I don't recall ever seeing him in that little cottage.
One morning in February 2008, Catherine's worst fears for her marriage were confirmed. Her house phone rang. She ignored it, but it incessantly rang and rang again. When she finally answered, she heard a slurry female voice on the other end of the line. It was a young paramedic called Michelle LaFrance.
She asked for Paul Novak, and it was at that moment that Catherine realized that her husband was definitely having an affair.
And that's when her life crumbles. She's got 2 kids she's got to raise on her own with no job in this small town.
Who was this woman intruding on Catherine's cozy rural life?
Paul's girlfriend was an unstable character.
Michelle LaFrance, a 25-year-old university student, had been assigned to the hospital ambulances group that Paul drove with. She'd had a history of suicide attempts, and her mental state was at times a bit shaky.
She was not somebody who had any business being in charge of life or death decisions that are made by paramedics, and yet she was riding as a paramedic. She was certified in New York.
Paul Novak and Michelle LaFrance bonded over their shared experiences of life and death on the New York streets. He took her out for a drink to celebrate the first time that she'd successfully intubated a patient who was struggling to breathe.
I mean, the whole story really hinges on this underworld, or this community of paramedics who, were witnesses to Paul Novak's bizarre behavior, witnesses to Michelle LaFrance's bizarre behavior.
Paul had fallen hard for Michelle LaFrance. When she reciprocated, he must have thought he'd hit the jackpot. She was young, she was pretty, she was feisty. She looked up to him as a lifesaver, a hero. Catherine Novak, on discovering about the affair, kicked her cheating husband Paul out of their little home in Narrowsburg.
I was standing in the yard, and I said, hello, and she said hello, and she said, oh, I've been looking for you. And right away she said, oh, I've been looking for you because my husband's having an affair and I need to get a job. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And she sort of giggled and acted like it didn't matter that much that he was having an affair, didn't go into any of the details, and just said, I need to get a job.
Paul Novak also looked like he'd moved on.
Soon after Catherine found out about the affair, Novak moved into an apartment in Glen Clove, Long Island with LaFrance. Novak agreed to pay $1,700 a month in child support and agreed to take the children every other weekend.
Catherine tried to get on board with the new reality. She took on 2 part-time jobs at the school and a local church camp, telling friends she wanted to save money so her children could one day go to college. She wouldn't let the children visit their father in Long Island before she had vetted LaFrance by taking her out to a local diner. There, she asked her husband's new girlfriend to help her shop for her son's birthday. But despite Catherine's best efforts, this was not an amicable separation.
We can tell things are starting to take a downward spiral.
Catherine filed for divorce, and they began talking about a settlement. At the same time, Novak was starting to badmouth Catherine, calling her an unfit mother, calling her a fat, ugly troll.
How he believes she's a terrible mother and how he is actually the victim, not Catherine. How he is the victim of having to deal with this woman who is so difficult. And she falls for it.
He had me convinced that Catherine was the bad guy and he was the good parent, and these kids are abused and these kids are miserable.
We do this for the kids.
And we need to save the kids.
The estranged couple argued bitterly on the phone about money and about who should care for their son and daughter. While she continued to present a smiling face to her friends and neighbours, Catherine felt less and less safe in her rural hideaway.
He wants to move on with his life. He wants to put everything in the past, and everything starts to become about money.
Catherine was increasingly anxious, and even though it doesn't seem like there were any direct threats against her safety, she did pay a neighbor to change the locks on the house.
She was right to be scared. Her isolated backcountry home made her an easy target when Paul Novak decided that it was time to cash in on the life insurance.
And we were up here for Christmas, and we were actually having a holiday dinner at a friend's house outside of Narrowsburg, and the local paper was on the table. And I looked at it, and there was a color picture on it of a fire or a charred house, and underneath it said, "Local woman dies in fire."
Had the lifesaver become a life taker? What story was unfolding upstate in New York? On the morning of the 13th of December 2008, a community woke to smoke and flames pouring from Catherine Novak's home on County Road 25.
Firefighters in Sullivan County were alerted to a fire.
Some people thought it was a sunrise, but somebody nearby recognized it was a fire and called the police.
Firefighters were on the scene by 6:46 that morning, and what they discovered was a fully engaged, raging fire.
It was a cold morning, it was December. The police arrived and the house was almost burned to the ground already.
Despite the freezing temperatures, unusual even for a New York winter, it took them hours to extinguish the blaze. When they were finally able to sift through the debris, they made two gruesome discoveries in the basement of the collapsed house.
Firefighters began the task of sifting through the ashes to see who might have even been in there.
They found Catherine's body on the floor and the dog in a kennel, also dead.
Early conclusions suggested an accident.
She had been crushed at some point by falling debris when the house collapsed in the fire.
Devastating as it was, emergency workers were relieved that those bodies of a woman and of a dog were the only ones that they found in the charred wreck of the Novak family home.
When firefighters searched through the debris, they weren't sure who they were going to find. They knew that 2 children lived at the address, but what they didn't know is that they had been spending the night at their father's house 100 miles away in Long Island that night.
Detectives suspected that Catherine had been the victim of foul play. As they examined the crime scene and Catherine Novak's body, there were a number of clues that simply didn't add up.
She had been found lying on the basement floor on her back with her arms outstretched. However, the back of her body wasn't burned.
Fire investigation experts found it odd that Catherine was lying on her back. It's far more common when someone had been killed in a fire to find victims lying in a fetal position, trying to protect themselves from the flames. There were other anomalies too. A post-mortem found that Catherine had not died of smoke inhalation as one might have expected.
The medical examiner drew several conclusions from the autopsy. The dog had inhaled smoke, but Catherine had not.
An autopsy later found that the levels of carbon monoxide in Catherine's lungs were not sufficient to kill her. Instead, they believed that she had died when the debris crushed her chest.
And there were people in the state police and especially the fire department here who suspected that that was not accurate, but there was nothing they could do about it.
If Catherine had not died from smoke inhalation or from being crushed by debris, what had caused her death? There was one final clue that indicated it may not have been accidental. She had 3 dislocated ribs and a strange pooling of blood around the sites of the fractures. This suggested to detectives that Catherine had been badly injured some minutes or hours before she had died. It showed Catherine may have suffered a violent assault. The finger of suspicion pointed towards Novak.
I remember picking up the phone and calling the state police and saying, "You're aware, of course, that she was engaged in a divorce?" And he said yes.
Police and firefighters had their suspicions at that point. They questioned Paul Novak about his whereabouts that night. His girlfriend, Michelle LaFrance, said that he had been home all night.
Paul Novak was adamant that he played no part in his wife's death. He later gave interviews where he protested his innocence, said that he had been shocked on hearing of the death of his former wife.
I actually found out that they found a body in the basement from my mother, who found out from one of the volunteer firefighters that was there. So when I initially went to the state police as directed to give my statement as they wanted, they told me that at that point they told me that a body was found there, but they weren't sure if it was Catherine's or not.
They interviewed him, he had an airtight alibi, and they let him go.
10 days after the fire, Paul passed a lie detector test. They had really no choice but to rule it as an accident.
Narrowsburg was left to mourn its unexplained loss.
She was a born volunteer, a giver, and there aren't a lot of people like that, and communities depend on them, so she left a hole in that sense. That's a loss for the community. She could have been somebody I could have seen running for office.
Unlike the rest of the grieving community, Paul Novak showed no interest in paying tribute to his deceased wife.
Paul didn't attend Catherine's funeral. Instead, he took the children, dropped them off at the service, and then picked them up afterwards. He didn't want anything to do with his wife, in life or death.
Perhaps he was too busy planning ways to spend the windfall that was coming his way.
Not long after Catherine's death, Novak left his job as an EMT in New York City.
Paul Novak then cashed in an $800,000 insurance policy and moved himself and his girlfriend and his 2 kids to a house that he bought for himself in Florida with an in-ground saltwater pool, and was aiming to live happily ever after.
Paul's wife was dead. It had been ruled an accident. He had an attractive younger girlfriend, custody of his 2 children, and a lot of cash in the bank to fund a luxurious new lifestyle, miles from the dirt and noise of the big city. It could have been the perfect murder. But for Paul Novak, old habits were to die hard. Perhaps missing the adrenaline of being an EMT, nostalgic for his secret trysts in the city, Paul's eye started to wander.
Paul and Michelle's relationship was troubled, and by early 2012, Michelle believed that Paul was having an affair.
Very soon after they were living together, they started to fight.
Paul joined an online dating site, and before long, he was seeing another woman behind Michelle's back. The medic seemed unable to stop his history of infidelity from repeating itself.
By the summer of 2012, Novak and Michelle had split up.
Eventually, she moved out of the house that she shared with him and the kids, moved into her own apartment in Florida, and would later tell police that she had dreams, nightmares that he was coming to kill her in the way that he had killed Catherine.
Life went on. Both of them found someone new. But whether inspired by guilt or a longing for revenge, Michelle couldn't shake the niggling feeling that she needed to come clean.
He had described to her how he killed Catherine, strangled her to death, and she couldn't get that out of her head.
And Michelle had started dating a police officer. And she started to feel a little bit guilty about some of the things that she had told the police in 2008 after the death of Novak's wife, Catherine.
That police deputy urged her to contact the New York State Police.
Michelle LaFrance made a phone call. that would bring the world of Paul Novak crashing down.
That summer, Michelle contacted the New York State Police, and in exchange for immunity, she told them that she had lied in her statement in 2008 about the death of Catherine.
Paul only had himself to blame when Michelle LaFrance decided she was no longer willing to keep his dirty secret. If only he could have stayed faithful to his girlfriend, she might not have given this evidence to cops.
What is he telling you that he wants to do, or how does that come about?
That he was going to kill Catherine.
Paul Novak's infidelity had caused his carefully constructed plan to unravel. The true story of Catherine's tragic death began to emerge. Was his lifelong infidelity about to become the mistake which would bring a killer to justice? In a police interview room, the woman who knew Paul Novak's secrets was telling all.
It was going to be done on a weekend that we had the kids, and he was going to burn the house down, and, you know, he's up there in the middle of nowhere, and nobody would know, nobody would see it.
Investigators flew to Florida and interviewed LaFrance for more than 6 hours. She told them that she had lied about Paul Novak's whereabouts that night, and that instead of him being at home with her in Glen Cove, he and his sometime partner, Scott Sherwood, had actually driven to Narrowsburg, New York, set fire to the house where Catherine lived, and killed her.
The reason why I think Paul Novak needed Scott Sherwood is that Paul didn't want his car to be traced to his ex-wife's house when he was going to try to murder her.
Detectives had enough to arrest Paul Novak and his ambulance partner, Scott Sherwood. Paul denied everything.
Did you kill your wife?
No, I did not.
According to his lawyer, the paramedic Scott Sherwood was relieved to finally be able to admit his role in the murder and the plot.
He helped corroborate what Michelle LaFrance testified to, and I truly believe everyone saw what type of person he really was. You talked to him for a minute, you saw how earnest he was, that he truly wanted to do the right thing, and probably if it was up to him, he would have cooperated from minute one.
Scott Sherwood pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, and in exchange for a shorter sentence, he agreed to testify against Novak. He told police and the jury what happened that night.
Between LaFrance and Sherwood, detectives formed a crystal clear picture of the depraved plot that had led to Catherine Novak's violent death.
I know it's not easy, but can you see anger building up in Paul, or is Paul talking about?
Paul was very calm.
Very calm? But did he...
Very controlled, very manipulative.
Paul Novak wanted rid of his wife. He wanted to have their 2 children to himself. So in winter 2008, he started scheming.
The plan came out in probably November to December. December, probably. It was very short time that I knew about it.
Okay.
And he was going to do this. He was going to do this and save the children.
How does the conversation go? Like, what is he telling you that he wants to do, or how does that come about?
That he was going to kill Catherine.
And he says that to you?
As a trained medic, Paul had worked out what he thought was the best way to kill his wife with a minimum of struggle and leaving behind as little evidence as he could.
He was going to chloroform her and leave her and then burn the house down around her, and she was going to die in the fire. That was his plan. And we were going to do it on a weekend that, we had the kids would be safe.
Novak had it all worked out, but he needed an accomplice. He didn't want his car to be seen anywhere near Narrowsburg that night. Paul chose someone he knew would be easily manipulated.
The guy who drove Paul Novak up here to commit the murder that night was a fellow EMT.
Having someone else's car would be in his best interest.
Why was this man, known as a gentle giant, willing to get involved in murder?
Since Paul and Scott worked together as paramedics in Long Island, and they're in the ambulances together, they went and they had a lot of downtime. They spoke a lot. And in the course of this, Paul learned a lot of intimate facts about Scott's life, mostly about a messy divorce that he had been going through and the pain he was suffering because of that.
Scott Sherwood, Novak's sometime partner, was a large man. He was also emotionally unstable. He'd recently gone through a divorce and had a history of bipolar disorder. He felt an affinity with Paul Novak.
Scott, being the kind person that he is, wanted to try to help Paul with not being in pain. The problem is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Why did he do this to Kathy?
Well, he said it to me because I don't want to end up like you.
And you having gone through a very rough divorce and are in a very difficult predicament with your ex. And obviously you're not happy about that.
You can manipulate even good people to do the wrong thing. And you just need someone with some very twisted morals to do that.
With Sherwood on board, Paul Novak was ready to put his plan into action.
On the night of December 12th, Sherwood went to Novak's Glen Cove apartment to pick him up. When he arrived, Novak was mixing up something that he said was chloroform.
The children were fast asleep in the next room, drugged.
Benadryl to the children so they wouldn't wake up when Paul was coming and going during the murder night.
It seemed like Paul Novak had every detail buttoned up.
Paul had indeed planned every detail of his road trip upstate with Scott.
He'd even left his cell phone in Nassau County so that it wouldn't be tracked.
While Scott was the chauffeur for the night, his attorney is adamant that he played no part in the violence that followed.
Scott Sherwood's course of conduct for this was to drive Paul Novak up. He didn't go in the house, he didn't do other things to advance the murder beyond driving him.
On the way up to Narrowsburg, they stopped to buy duct tape and gloves.
They parked a mile away, Scott's car hidden among the trees. Sherwood, the dutiful wingman, waited in the dark as he watched his friend approach the house where Catherine Novak, unsuspecting, slept in her bed.
Sherwood told police that when he left the car, Novak was dressed in hospital surgical scrubs. He had booties over his shoes and was wearing a hat and gloves. He had also duct taped his sleeves and cuffs to make sure that no evidence would be left at the scene of the crime.
Goes into the house, goes into the basement, sets off the smoke alarm, which then wakes Catherine up. She's alone in the house. She goes downstairs.
What does he say happened inside the house? He says this to you, right? In the car?
Yeah. He had said that the chloroform didn't work. I had to strangle her.
Paul Novak tried to chloroform her, didn't work.
A violent struggle began.
I mean, he killed her. He strangled her to death.
In her final moments, Catherine Novak knew exactly what was happening. Her husband took hold of her sweatshirt and tightened it around her neck until she stopped breathing.
Did he say if Catherine mentioned anything during the struggle?
Why are you doing this?
And what was his response?
Doing this for the kids.
After setting the house alight and waiting for a while to make sure the fire took hold, Paul Novak returned to the car. He showed no sign of being shaken by the horrific scenes that he'd experienced moments earlier.
What was his demeanor when he came back from the house?
Seemed cold, distant.
What about you? Were you like, holy f***, why?
I was beside myself.
Calmly, Paul Novak drove back to the city by a different route, and the last detail in Novak's meticulous plan was executed.
When you leave, who drives?
I had Paul drive because, well, I started heading out of the area. I guess made it to the closest county road, and it was a little too windy and it was dark, so I told Paul, you better drive, I can't.
Along the way, they stopped at an abandoned gas station where Novak could get rid of the scrubs and the gloves.
It came close to being, as Paul had intended, the perfect murder. Back home on Long Island, he told the whole sordid tale to his girlfriend Michelle LaFrance. It was a huge mistake. 4 years later, she would recount his actions, word for word, to detectives. After his arrest and throughout his trial, Paul Novak continued to deny his crime.
And he continues to read me my Miranda rights, and I said, do I need a lawyer? He goes, well, you know, if you ask for a lawyer, it won't really look that good. We like you. We know you didn't have anything to do with this, but the DA wants us to ask you some questions just to keep you in the clear and make everyone feel a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, all right. I mean, I don't have anything to hide. You can ask me anything you want. And that's when he told me that something had happened to Catherine.
I think Paul Novak only cared about Paul Novak, and he got a large sum of money from the insurance, which was pretty much all gone by the end of this case, where his kids pretty much got nothing as far as I understand.
In court, Paul claimed that LaFrance and Sherwood had murdered Catherine without his knowledge.
He really just wanted the case to go his way. So that's the only thing I really can say. Paul Novak wasn't an open guy.
But Novak's friend and girlfriend had no motive to murder Novak's wife, and their combined testimony was compelling.
He helped corroborate what Michelle LaFrance testified to.
A jury convicted Paul Novak of the murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. In return for his cooperation, Scott Sherwood was sentenced to just 18 months. The woman that Paul had fallen for, then cheated on, walked away from court. No charges were brought.
Paul Novak's biggest mistake was trusting Michelle LaFrance. If their relationship hadn't broken down, it's possible that she would have kept his secret forever.
Novak thought he could deprive the world of Catherine and get away with it. He was wrong. Paul Novak told all to Michelle LaFrance. He then cheated on her and expected her to keep his secret. That was his killer's mistake. A local politician with a fearsome reputation is in a coma in a Nevada hospital.
It was jarring to think of her going down like that.
Her husband is quick to claim she's been struck down by a catastrophic illness.
There was a television report on Kathy Augustine being in the hospital. It was kind of a press conference. Chaz Higgs was there, and he said she'd had a heart attack.
Her friends don't believe it. Doctors are skeptical.
They couldn't really find any reason why Kathy, 50 years old, never drank, didn't smoke, and worked out regularly, would have had a heart attack.
Has the husband of an American politician found a way to commit the perfect murder? Has a narcissist killed a woman getting in his way?
Murder is collateral damage on their life trajectory, on their series of exciting projects. A person is an obstacle to be discarded.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Chaz Higgs as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake?
Everything's gonna be okay.
Chaz Higgs and Kathy Augustine first locked eyes over the deathbed of Kathy's husband, Charles. Oddly, perhaps, given the circumstances, they felt a connection.
Chaz would later say that they had chemistry. They had instant chemistry. And when they met in the hospital, it was one of those things.
British forensic psychologist Donna Perry tracks the timelines of the lives of killers. She's been researching Chaz Higgs and his behaviour that day was very much in character.
His romances mirror his whole approach to life. It's one passionate encounter followed by another.
Charles Augustine, who was in the critical care unit of a Las Vegas hospital after suffering a massive stroke, was Kathy's third husband. By 2003, he and Kathy had been married for 17 years, but the relationship was on the rocks.
Charles and Kathy Augustine were estranged and heading toward divorce when he fell ill.
Friends suspected that their marriage had fallen victim to Kathy's soaring political ambition, something that she'd harboured since a girl, and long before she met Charles Augustine, or Chuck as he was known to friends.
Chuck Augustine's wife, Kathy, was born Kathy Alfano in California. When she was growing up, her passion had always been politics, and she was growing up in the 60s and 70s at a time when women were leaving the house, attaining more.
She was very highly educated. She had a bachelor's degree, she had a master's degree, and she had served an internship in Washington, D.C. around the time that she was in college.
But then her plans were derailed by love, marriage, children.
But then she got married twice, divorced twice, had a young daughter, and went to work for an airline, and she put her political ambitions aside for about 12 years.
She began working for an airline, sometimes as a flight attendant, traveling around the world and around the country, and then later in scheduling.
It was during this time that Kathy, who would tell friends she was lousy at choosing men, met Chuck Augustine.
In 1986, Kathy met a Delta Airlines pilot called Chaz Augustine. Chaz Augustine was 15 years her senior. He'd been a football player earlier in life. He was also a Vietnam vet and a devout Catholic. They fell in love and got married and moved to the Las Vegas area.
For a few years, the couple were happy. They bought a large, luxurious home in downtown Las Vegas. The children from their former marriages got on well. It was a harmonious family. In time, Kathy started to feel the lure of politics once again. Her ambitions rekindled as she re-entered the Republican Party.
Kathy Augustine was very well known in the state of Nevada. She was known as a hard-charging, very strong, very dynamic state politician. She reveled in politics. She loved the rough and tumble of politics.
Kathy campaigned to become a member of the Nevada State Assembly, and she won. She served a term, then ran for the state Senate, and again was successful.
She had run for and won election to the office of State Controller of Nevada. She was actually the first female state controller in Nevada's history.
She was the state's bill collector, more or less.
You can't be a shrinking violet and have that job and be any good at it. And Kathy Augustine was very good at her job as state controller.
But Kathy's political career didn't set well with her husband, Chuck. A quiet, conservative man, he didn't want to be in the limelight. He wanted to be at home, and he wanted his wife at home with him. Local journalist Victoria Campbell knew Kathy as a woman who wouldn't let anything or anyone stand in the way of her ambitions.
I interviewed Kathy Augustine on numerous occasions. She struck me as tenacious, very tough. She was a very tough woman and tough to talk to sometimes. She just had her eyes on what she wanted. She was ambitious.
The pressure that put on her relationship was starting to show. And by 1998, they were separated.
Charles and Kathy Augustine were estranged and heading toward divorce when he fell ill.
In 2003, when Charles Augustine was hospitalized following a stroke, he and his wife still shared their Vegas home. But they'd been living separate lives for almost 4 years. Kathy was buying herself a smaller property over 400 miles away in Reno, closer to her work at the state capitol. Despite this, she was a frequent visitor during the 6 weeks that her husband spent in hospital. And it was here that she met critical care nurse Chaz Higgs. William Charles Higgs was also someone with a checkered relationship history.
Not a lot is known about Chaz Higgs' early life, but between 1984 and 2002, he had 3 failed marriages. He changed state and job quite a lot and drifted.
Chaz was raised by his father, who was in the Marines.
My sense is that he came out of quite a hard background. a background where he didn't learn how to care about other people because it was a tough background where other people weren't particularly caring about him. It fits with the idea of an upbringing led by a military man.
Chaz Higgs followed his father into the armed forces. He trained as a Navy SEAL and spent 16 years as a medical corpsman looking after the health of sailors in naval clinics and at sea. Along the way, there were 3 failed marriages and many accusations of infidelity. Chaz moved around a lot and filed for a string of bankruptcies as he did.
We've got somebody who has an inability to self-regulate, somebody who's always looking for excitement, somebody who's immature, and somebody who is very emotionally fluent, is very warm and charming and open. Put all those things together and you get somebody who is going to move from woman to woman very readily and is going to appeal to a lot of women as well, so it's easy for him to do that.
But things looked like they were about to take a turn for the better in the life of Chaz Higgs. Was he finally ready to settle down?
By 2002, after the breakdown of his last marriage, Chaz was living in Nevada. He had seemed to be a bit more stable.
He took a number of medical qualifications and in 2002 received his state nursing license. He got a post at the Sunrise Medical Center in Las Vegas as a critical care nurse.
He was living in an RV, but he seemed to be moving towards an actual career by now.
Had Chaz Higgs finally found his calling? He seemed to take to nursing like a duck to water, but it wouldn't be long before he was putting his medical training to more nefarious uses. And his new wife, Kathy, would be playing the unfortunate patient.
He would have been comfortable going into nursing, of holding other people's lives in his hands, not because he cared so much, but because actually other people's lives were so unimportant to him, certainly much less important than Chaz Higgs's life.
The descent to murder had begun in the emotionally charged atmosphere of a Las Vegas hospital's critical care unit, where Nevada State Controller Kathy Augustine had met the charismatic, handsome nurse, 8 years her junior, who found her as captivating as she found him.
Chuck Augustine spent 6 weeks at the intensive care unit, and during that time he had a number of visitors, including his wife, Kathy.
He suffered a minor stroke at their home in Las Vegas, was taken to the hospital, then suffered a major stroke in the hospital and while he was being treated, and was seriously ill. One of his nurses was Chaz Higgs.
After 6 weeks, he unfortunately passed away, but Kathy's relationship to the intensive care team at the hospital didn't end there.
Chaz would later say that they had chemistry, and when they met in the hospital, it was one of those things.
Whether by accident or design, soon after her husband's death, Kathy found herself seeing the nurse again.
Kathy wrote thank you notes to all of the staff, but she forgot to write one to Chaz. In order to make up for that, she decided to invite him out for coffee, and that was when their romance began.
It was the classic whirlwind romance. Kathy and her late husband had a holiday planned, a luxury trip to Hawaii. Suddenly facing the prospect of spending the break alone, Kathy invited her new lover, Chaz Higgs.
Chaz and Kathy's relationship progressed quickly, very quickly. Within 3 weeks, they had gotten married on a holiday to Hawaii.
I would venture to say that Kathy Augustine probably hoped for what most people hope for, a meaningful, happy relationship. And this being her 4th marriage, it was not something that she had been able to have before.
For Kathy, who was perhaps used to more intellectual, reserved men, who was part of a calculating political world, Chaz actually would have been a breath of fresh air in his warmth, his openness.
Kathy Augustine told her family, he's an angel to me. He swept me off my feet.
Those closest to Kathy were skeptical. It was hard to see them as a match made in heaven.
I think there were probably some questions and, people kind of looking askance at that relationship and wondering what she saw in him and what he saw in her. They were both very dynamic, attractive people, but whether they belonged together, I think there were a lot of questions asked about that.
The relationship between Chaz and Kathy was not something that their friends could have predicted. She was 8 years his senior, and they didn't really seem to have a ton in common.
Despite their reservations, all Kathy's friends wanted was for her to be happy, and for the first few months, that's how she seemed to be.
At the start of their relationship, things seemed to be going very well. Kathy gushed to her friends that she'd never been happier.
Straight out of the gate, it appeared that she was happy.
Chaz was athletic, had always been interested in keeping up his appearance and looking good. Over the course of their relationship, however, he got Kathy into shape, he got her interested in working out, and they seemed to be ticking along fairly well.
Chaz enjoyed a new, comfortable, even luxurious lifestyle, something he'd never had in the Navy or on a nurse's salary. It was made possible by marrying Kathy.
By that time, she had also received the payout from Chuck's life insurance, which amounted to about $1 million.
The warning signs were perhaps there. When she met him, Chaz was bad with money. But Kathy was smitten. She sang her new man's praises to her friends and family.
He'd always been terrible with money, and friends suspected that part of Kathy's appeal in the first place was that she was fairly wealthy.
Chaz seemed drawn to Kathy's status as a well-known politician. She was almost a celebrity.
She was an easy route to success. She had glamour, she had status potentially. He thought that she was an easy route to the fairy tale ending that he believes is his destiny.
But it was also this very aspect of Kathy's life and personality that quickly began to drive a wedge between the couple.
He wanted her to quit politics. When she didn't quit politics, it aggravated him.
On some level, he knows that he can't function in the grown-up world like the political world.
Chaz Higgs also did not have any interest in politics whatsoever, and he hated going to the dinners and the public events, and he had absolutely no interest in that. In 2004, the marriage was already foundering. She was moving things out of Chaz's name and into a trust that would go to her daughter.
In September of that year, Kathy was impeached for a campaign ethics violation and was forced to pay a fine of $15,000. That seemed to derail her political career somewhat, and she had to work to recover her good name.
In 2004, Kathy became the first Nevada state constitutional officer to be impeached by the Assembly. She was found guilty and censured, but she was allowed to remain in office. The episode hit her reputation, though, and her wallet. She was fined a record $15,000 and made £500 a month payments on the fine until November 2005, when she paid off the balance, 5 months after refinancing her Las Vegas home. Whether frustrated that money had become tighter, annoyed that his wife was no longer the celebrated local figure he'd married, or resentful at how much time Kathy was spending rebuilding her career, Higgs started acting up.
The stress of that situation may have caused more problems in their relationship. By autumn of 2005, Chaz was really bad-mouthing Kathy quite a lot to colleagues at work.
He wanted her to lose weight. He called her a fat bitch and that sort of thing.
Clearly, they were not getting along. They just didn't mesh. He didn't like the scene she was in. She wanted him to like it and to go with her to these events and things, and he just didn't want any part of that.
Chaz became increasingly vain, even obsessive about his appearance. Was he perhaps looking for a new way to gain status and excitement?
He'd also gotten into bodybuilding and was spending most of his nights at the gym. Chaz had also gotten into steroids and was stockpiling medicine at home.
These Peter Pan figures, emotional Peter Pan figures, are also incredibly immature, and we see evidence of that in the unrealistic approach that they take to life. They're forever getting into problems with their money, becoming bankrupt. They're forever taking on some new project with a ridiculous, intense ardency for a while.
By early summer 2006, Chaz Higgs seems to have come to a decision. Just as he had set his mind at different times to finding a wife, becoming a nurse, or getting fit, now he was setting his mind on his next project, getting out of his marriage. He made no attempt to hide this desire from fellow nurses.
Anytime he was busy, and one of them would say, and all of them testified to this, and there were several, one of them would say, "Is there anything I can help you with?" And he'd say, "Yeah, get rid of my wife."
Chaz Higgs made no secret of his growing resentment of his wife, Kathy. He joked frequently about getting rid of her.
He was saying terrible things about his wife to his coworkers. If I didn't have a daughter in Las Vegas, I would kill my wife and throw her down a mine shaft.
He started a flirtatious relationship with a colleague, Linda Ramirez. He emailed her saying, "You've touched my heart, and I want to be with you."
3 years after they got married, Chaz was cautioned by his superiors for using his email, his work email, to send flirtatious messages to a colleague.
He had been romancing other women, that he had joined a website called passion.com and was sending emails to other women.
These emails would later prove interesting to Chief Deputy District Attorney Tom Bobb.
And we had witnesses as far as he was flirting with one of the people that worked at the hospital. He was, say, he sent her an email, said, "I'm going to make Kathy," he said, "that bitch, Kathy's life miserable."
Again and again, Higgs blurted out his darkest thoughts and feelings. This lack of discretion would very soon come back to haunt him. In the meantime, he was summoned to his manager to explain why he'd been misusing his hospital email account.
He said he was reaching out to these other women because he was sad, he was angry, he was venting.
He confided to his supervisor, Tina, that things with Kathy were problematic. He described her as abusive and controlling, and Tina started to get concerned.
Worried about her employees' personal safety, Tina offered Chaz somewhere to go should he ever need it.
Tina suspected that Chaz might be the victim of abuse, so she offered him a place to stay if he needed it.
Somehow, word of this got back to Kathy. Increasingly desperate for the state of her marriage, and suspecting that this other woman was making a play for her husband, the once strong, dignified, intimidating politician lost her composure.
Kathy somehow found out and began harassing Tina at her place of work. Eventually, Kathy wrote threatening letters to Tina, and Tina eventually took the matter to the hospital board. And after that, Kathy's harassment seemed to stop.
Kathy was clinging to the relationship, determined this one was going to last the course. She tried to speak to Chaz about their crumbling marriage. He refused to talk. Eventually, she kicked him out for emptying their bank accounts, and then let him move back in.
She told this friend that Chaz had said he wanted to leave her, and she didn't want him to leave. She wanted to make a go of it. She wanted it to work.
Kathy's friends and family would later recall that she seemed to have become scared of what her unpredictable husband might be capable of.
While Chaz was making it seem to Tina that he was being abused, the evidence seems to suggest that maybe something else was going on. For example, Kathy called her brother one day from the car, crying, sobbing, and saying he's gonna kill us both because Chaz was driving erratically, crazy.
She was right to be frightened. At 6:45 a.m. on Saturday, 8th of July, 2006, Chaz Higgs dialed 911 from Kathy's house in Reno.
Higgs is on the telephone, 911, "My wife is not breathing. I need help."
He said he had found his wife in her bed, unresponsive and not breathing. The dispatcher taking the call would later report that he'd never heard someone so calm in such a situation, who could give such detailed directions to the home and carry on such a lengthy conversation. Why wasn't Chaz Higgs panicking?
He was real kind of nonchalant about the whole thing. Everybody commented about his demeanor, his tone of voice, that sort of thing on the 911 call.
When the call was later played in court, everyone listening was struck by how calm and unruffled Higgs seemed to be. He talked at a normal pace, in almost a monotone, as he began.
"Something's wrong with my wife. She's not breathing."
"She's not breathing at all?"
"Not breathing at all."
He didn't seem to be too affected by the fact that his wife wasn't breathing or anything like that.
A little later, Higgs said that she had no medical problems that he was aware of, but did accept she'd been stressed over the previous 6 months.
When the ambulance folks arrived, she was still on the bed, and I think they found a faint heartbeat.
Chaz told paramedics that he had attempted resuscitation, but when they arrived, they found her still in the bed. This was suspicious because as a trained medical professional, he should know that in order to resuscitate someone, they have to be on a hard surface, not a soft bed.
The situation seemed odd, even sinister, but there was little time to lose in trying to save her life.
They did resuscitate her enough to get a heartbeat, blood pressure, that sort of thing going, and then they put her in the ambulance and took her to the renowned Med South.
As Chaz accompanied his wife to hospital, ambulance staff could not help but notice his cool demeanor, even as the blue lights flashed and the sirens blared.
He was even reading a newspaper.
As they hooked the now comatose Kathy Augustine up to the life support machines at the nearby hospital, nurses began to ask themselves how this strong, fit, feisty politician had ended up so gravely ill.
The first nurses said, "This doesn't look right. She's not, 50 years old, no history of anything. Doesn't look like heart attack to me, or at least the normal heart attack protocol."
Some very alert nurses thought this just didn't look right. She was a very vivacious, apparently healthy 50-year-old woman, and that's not normal for her to just come in a comatose state, for her heart to stop, and she stops breathing, and paramedics have to revive her and rush her to the hospital.
What had Chaz Higgs done to his wife? 3 days later, as Kathy's family considered whether her life support should be switched off, detectives also began to question what actually had happened.
To put it all together, that was the challenge. How do you go from a healthy 50-year-old female to a dead 50-year-old female?
The day after he called paramedics to their home in Reno, Chaz Higgs told assembled reporters about the medical condition of his wife, State Controller Kathy Augustine.
It was kind of a press conference. Chaz Higgs was there.
Higgs told the press that Kathy had suffered from heartburn and stomach pains in the day before, and that he believed that it was a cardiac arrest as a result of campaign stress.
And he said she'd had a heart attack. I don't know where he got that information or what made him say that.
Higgs suggested that his wife may have fallen victim to the stress of hard work and long days. To Kathy's family and friends, that simply didn't ring true.
They knew her as a person who thrived on stress, and something like that wasn't enough to do it.
The scuttlebutt was that it may have been a heart problem, and of course that's not always obvious, and people get sick and die every day from heart problems.
Kathy's doctors were baffled. In the run-up to her so-called heart attack, she'd been in good health, and when they examined her, they could find nothing to explain her condition.
Doctors, meanwhile, couldn't find any evidence of heart disease, and they couldn't really find any reason why Kathy, 50 years old, never drank, didn't smoke, and worked out regularly, would have had a heart attack.
If there had been a heart attack, except for, I guess there are exceptions to every rule, but if there had been a heart attack, there would have been evidence in the heart muscle or in the arteries around the heart, that sort of thing. And there was none of that.
As Kathy's condition deteriorated, and with her extended family by her bedside, her estranged husband, Chaz, was taking care of business.
And then the news just became progressively worse. She was in a coma. She had irreversible brain damage.
Kathy was in a coma for 3 days. And during that time, Chaz made sure that her $1,100 a month state pension was signed over to him.
And it would be his $1,100 a month for the rest of his life. Now, nobody thought that was an extremely large amount of money, but I'm thinking I could live, pretty well with $1,100 a month more than I was working for.
Colleagues were struck once again by Higgs's demeanor when they saw him. He didn't seem like a man whose wife, a woman he professed to love, was lying desperately unwell in hospital.
The day after she was admitted, he went to go pick up a paycheck from a colleague, and even brought that colleague a box of donuts as a thank you.
He was checking on her pension. He was bringing donuts to the nurses. He was not always, as nurses would later testify, behaving as a husband who was deeply concerned about his wife, who was lying there in a comatose state.
How was Chaz Higgs able to carry on seemingly without a care in the world? Was he in shock? Was he putting on a brave face? Or was it because Kathy's condition was exactly what he wanted? After 3 days, it became clear she wasn't going to regain consciousness. Her family made the agonizing decision to turn off her life support. It was a body blow, not only for those who knew and loved her, but for all of her supporters.
On July 11th, 2006, Kathy's family made the decision to take her off of life support, and she died.
When news came that Kathy Augustine had died in the hospital, that life support had been terminated 3 days in, I think the public felt terrible for her and for her family. We had lost someone who held a very high office in this state, who had blazed a trail for female politicians, for all politicians, and she was gone.
As Kathy's family prepared to bury her, Chaz Higgs at last showed some sign of being affected by the tragedy.
On July 14th, Chaz Higgs attempted suicide. He was found by Kathy's daughter, Dallas, having slit his wrist and was briefly hospitalized. He missed Kathy's funeral.
Slits the wrist, but not very well, and lays down in the bathtub in the house that he and Kathy had in Las Vegas. Wrote a big long note blaming other people in this world. Signs it sincerely, Chaz Higgs. It says, "I'm going to see my wife."
Did Chaz Higgs really intend to kill himself? And if he did, what was he feeling? Grief? Remorse? Or something else?
The suicide attempt following the murder is one of the most psychologically revealing of all factors here. The fact that even this has to become about Chaz is terribly revealing. And I don't think for a minute that he wasn't suffering the pain, but the fact that it was a pain produced by himself, is again just a classic symptom of the immaturity, of the lack of self-regulation, of self-analysis, of self-awareness, of these type of Peter Pan psychological characters.
With a cloud of suspicion still hanging over what happened to Kathy, there was an autopsy. It failed to establish a cause of death. Doctors and police were mystified.
Nothing was found in the sense of a cause of death. Found that her heart was in good shape, that her lungs were in good shape. There was no evidence of a brain bleed or anything like that.
But they did have a breakthrough of sorts. They came across something during the post-mortem examination of Kathy's body that no one could explain, and it reinforced the suspicions that investigators had, that Kathy may have been the victim of foul play.
There was a puncture wound on her hip. It had turned black and blue a little bit, as if whoever did it was in a rush or didn't know quite how to get it done without hurting somebody.
Neither the hospital nor the paramedics had administered a drug to Kathy via an injection in her hip.
No one could explain it. When samples of Kathy's tissues and blood were examined by the hospital toxicologist after her death, they found only traces of drugs that had been given to Kathy legitimately by the doctors, nurses, and paramedics who'd been caring for her.
The blood and tissue samples came up with nothing.
When the autopsy was finished and there was no apparent cause of death that resulted from those tests, I think all of us knew something was up.
So it was just, I have no case, there's nothing to prosecute, she just died.
Chaz, meanwhile, was ready to move on with his life. The wounds from his apparent suicide attempt were healing. Newly widowed, he had his job, he had Kathy's pension. It looked as though whatever he'd done to his wife, he was going to get away with this.
I didn't have enough information to question the death, and I didn't have enough information to say, oh, she just died.
Unbeknownst to Chaz Higgs, investigators were not ready to let go of their suspicions. In fact, while Kathy was still alive, lying in a critical care bed fighting for survival, two things had happened that would later help prosecutors nail Chaz Higgs for his crime. The first was that quick-thinking nurses trusted their gut instincts when Kathy was rushed into hospital. Something simply didn't add up about her condition.
She or they, the two of them, decided to take the body fluids from Kathy right upon her entry into that hospital. They were taken, removed to the lab area of that hospital, refrigerated.
These very alert nurses took blood samples and urine samples and put them in a refrigerator under an assumed name.
This doesn't look right, we're taking the fluids, thank you.
The second thing that happened a day or two later was that Kim Ramey, a colleague of Higgs, got in touch with the police. She reported a conversation that she'd had with Higgs at work on July the 7th, the day before his wife was taken ill.
Chaz confided in a coworker that he was considering divorce. Later that same day, with the same coworker, Kim Ramey, he happened to mention a news story in which a husband had killed his wife.
Chaz Higgs said, he did it all wrong. If I'm going to kill someone, I'm just going to hit him with a shot of Sux or succinylcholine.
And he made the injection kind of movement with his hand. And she said that scared her a good deal. She said the hair on her arms stood up.
He said that it would have been much better if the husband had used succinylcholine, because that particular drug, a paralytic that's very frequently found on crash carts in intensive care units and emergency rooms, isn't traceable after death.
The drug is quick acting as far as paralyzes quickly. It's also quick acting as far as it moves out of the system quickly.
And it was because of Kim Ramey that the case really took off, and they knew what to test for and they knew what to look for because of a comment that he had made.
If this was really what Chaz Higgs had injected his wife with, it was a remarkably cruel way to kill her.
Succinylcholine is used by anesthesiologists to paralyze the throat muscles, the lungs, so that they can intubate a person without causing too much harm and without much fight back from them.
It's a general paralytic, but when too much is given, it can be fatal. And even more horrifically, the person is often aware of what's happening, and it takes about 6 to 10 minutes to die. They can feel it the entire time.
I think what struck me most about this case was how cold and how calculated this death was. Imagine giving someone a drug that stops them from breathing and stops them from crying out or calling for help or moving. A drug that's going to make someone suffocate to death in front of you. For 6 or 8 minutes, they know they're going to die, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's an agonizing death.
It's part and parcel of somebody this naive and self-centered that the drug he chose was one that caused a lot of suffering to the victim. He just wouldn't have thought that through properly.
Chaz Higgs had chosen this method to kill Kathy Augustine because the drug wouldn't be detected post-mortem. But quick-witted medical staff treating Kathy had taken samples from her while she was still alive. And after Kim Ramey's phone call to police, they knew exactly what they should be looking for.
If those nurses had not gone in and gotten those fluids, it would have been a whole lot harder, if not impossible, to make a case against Chaz Higgs.
We sent the body, the tissue samples and the fluids to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, where they began testing them. And this was in July.
A waiting game began. Despite everything, despite him telling colleagues he wanted his wife dead, despite his boasting about the best way to kill someone, if the toxicology report had come back clean, detectives would simply have not have had the evidence they needed to prove that Chaz Higgs was a killer.
You're waiting 2 months, 2.5 months to get evidence that there even was a crime.
We didn't know what was happening behind the scenes as far as body fluids and tissue samples being sent to the FBI laboratory in Virginia.
We didn't get the results back till September 26th, I think.
September 26th, investigators got the news that they'd been waiting for. Traces of the anesthetic drug succinylcholine had been found in the samples sent to the FBI.
Police put out a warrant for Chaz's arrest, and on September 29, 2006, he was found and arrested in Hampton, Virginia.
It was at this point that detectives were able to seize even more evidence that would prove beyond a doubt that Chaz Higgs had poisoned his wife. When they came to search his car, they almost couldn't believe their luck.
At the time of his arrest, he was carrying a backpack that contained a nursing manual. There was a bookmark on the page about administering sakincholine.
There was a packet of 3x5 cards, for lack of a better description. And the very top one was a card that dealt with succinylcholine, administration, use, that sort of thing.
For a man concerned with committing the perfect murder, how had Higgs come to leave such an incriminating trail of evidence?
People like this do often get caught by the carelessness, which is typical of such egocentric people. They're so unconcerned with other people that the flip side is that they're very unaware of the clues that they're leaving.
Despite making it easy for prosecutors to prove his guilt, Higgs flatly denied he had anything to do with Kathy Augustine's death.
He said, I love my wife. I wouldn't do that. What I wanted to do, or what the purpose of my cross-examination was to point out to everybody within hearing distance that what he said was complete and utter junk.
None of his stories stacked up. He told lie after lie. The jury bought none of them.
He just wasn't believable in anything he said. He was just a liar.
Chaz Higgs' trial continued through 2007, and on June 29, 2007, he was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he almost immediately went on suicide watch. Higgs' defense team attempted an appeal, but in May of 2009, the Supreme Court of Nevada upheld the conviction.
He got life with the possibility of parole after 20 years.
In the end, Chaz Higgs might have been a trained nurse, but his personality was fatally flawed. The way he went about killing his wife would have been clever if he'd been able to resist boasting about it. When he mouthed off to his colleagues, he gave detectives the impetus to pursue him.
Chaz Higgs' biggest mistake was telling Kim Ramey that the best way to kill someone was to use sakincholine, because it couldn't be traced.
And once he thought he was home and dry, Higgs made little attempt to cover his tracks.
That big mistake then put a spotlight on all of his littler mistakes, including having a nursing handbook with a bookmark on the page about administering sakincholine.
The absolute self-centeredness which made it possible, made it easy for Chaz to discard of Kathy, also in the end trips him up, produces the carelessness in his behaviour which trips him up.
As a man and as a killer, Chaz Higgs was fatally flawed. His selfish pursuit of the projects that excited him led him through 4 marriages, a handful of bankruptcies, and eventually the callous murder of his wife, Kathy Augustine. Unable to keep his obsession to himself, he blurted out bits of his plan to co-workers and friends. And unable to see beyond his immediate desire to kill his wife, he left behind a trail of clues. Clues which added up to the killer's mistakes. It was a fairy tale wedding, but for Claire Morris, there would be no happy ending.
He decided he was going to stage a road traffic collision and effectively set the vehicle on fire with his wife in the passenger seat, incapacitated, and effectively burn her to death.
Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Malcolm Webster as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Claire Morris was a happy little girl. She was close to her family.
We've been a close family since we lost my dad when we were 7 and 9 respectively, and Claire was more the practical person. She'd help around the home a bit more. She was gardener and that sort of thing. And she was a good sister.
But for the little boy who would grow up to marry Claire, life was less simple.
It does seem that Malcolm Webster had quite a strange childhood. I don't think it's one that we would describe as particularly normal or even functioning incredibly well. His dad was in quite a powerful job in the police force. He was head of the fraud squad, and it's said by people that he was an incredibly controlling man, and he ruled his family. And I think Malcolm especially felt that he was at the bottom, the very bottom of the pecking order.
He stood out for all of the wrong reasons. He was not like other boys.
There were some behavioural difficulties noted with Malcolm Webster. From when he was a child, he was known to be attention-seeking. He always wanted attention, but he always seemed to want to get his own way as well. And he would often fake illnesses, and he would pretend to faint, and that probably got him the attention that he was craving at the time.
There are many occasions where we've got evidence that even as a youngster, again going back to his teenage years, where he'd feigned the fact that he had a brain tumour, a life-threatening illness.
Webster struggled to carve out a place for himself, but finally settled on a career.
He decided that he wanted to train to be a nurse. His mother had been a nurse, and I suppose it's not that surprising given that he was always ill himself or feigning illness himself.
It was this career choice that brought him into contact with Claire Morris.
Claire was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for some years. She'd done all training in London. She'd put her career as an important thing, and she put that in front of a relationship. She wanted to get qualified as a state-registered nurse, and then I think she specialised in eye care.
The pair met at a house party in London and hit it off immediately.
She was sharing a house in Dulwich with some friends, and I believe that she met Malcolm at a party. After which, the next day, he came down and was showering her with flowers and gifts and what have you. And he seemed a gentleman. He seemed the sort of person that Claire would be interested in, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him.
The couple moved to rural Scotland, and in the early 90s, they married. Claire's brother vividly recalls the happy day.
It was a traditional Scottish wedding, had a bit of class to it. Not so much a disco afterwards as a ceilidh, which is good fun, all prancing about, doing silly dances, and they thoroughly approved it.
The wedding day appeared perfect, but Webster's vow till death us do part masked a more sinister motive.
It seems that after they got married in 1993, that's when Webster really starts to escalate things. It's like, you know, he's got the marriage now, he's safe in that relationship. It means he's got entitlements from that relationship. And we see during that time that Claire had 10 life insurance policies against her life and a big mortgage protection policy. So it seems that even before they were married, and definitely after they got married, he had a plan that this marriage was not going to last.
Malcolm suggested Claire make a will too.
About 2 years in, he gets Claire to change her will, and he is the sole beneficiary. He gets absolutely everything. Probably didn't raise any red flags for her, because that's not necessarily an unusual thing for a committed couple to do.
Claire was deeply in love with Webster. Her brother noticed the intense hold that he had over her.
Well, there were times when Malcolm told her to take her hands out of her pockets, and she did. If I'd told that to Claire, she'd have told me to clear off. He'd managed to sort of wind this spell over her, really, but at the time he wound that spell over all of us.
By spring 1994, Claire's health was deteriorating.
On many occasions in the early months of their marriage, friends, family of Claire noticed, indeed Claire herself was concerned that she was undergoing periods of blackouts, dizziness. Clearly she knew herself that there was something wrong within her, and Malcolm, he would sideline that and he would minimise it and trivialise the symptoms that she was suffering from. But friends and family, she visited her GP, they thought it was perhaps epilepsy.
She's tired, she's confused, she's forgetting things, and she doesn't know what's going on. That's terrifying for her. But there is her husband saying, don't worry, rely on me, and I will take care of it all, because you are clearly not capable.
There was much Claire didn't know about her new husband. She had no idea he was secretly feeding her sedatives.
He was using a combination of epilepsy drugs and sleeping tablets, whose effect, of course, is to make you drowsy. And I don't think there's any much doubt that what he was trying to do at the very least was to cause Claire to become more malleable, more confused, more uncertain, more under his influence.
But that wasn't all. Malcolm was hiding his lifelong fascination with fire. Since his school days, he'd been a pyromaniac.
He was known in his friendship group, or with the people that knew him anyway, the children that knew him, for setting fires. He would brag about his skill in setting fires.
Mid-1994, and the Websters appear a happy couple. No one is suspicious of the insurance policies taken out on Claire's life. Nobody would have guessed that Claire's pyromaniac husband had hidden several cans of petrol in the boot of their car. And Claire herself would never have imagined that to Malcolm Webster, she was of more value dead than alive. Malcolm Webster had always loved acting, and it seemed he didn't know when to stop.
His whole adult life was nothing other than a performance. He was into amateur drama as a young man, and I think he played that through for the rest of his days.
His thespian abilities were to stand him in good stead as he embarked on a plan to kill. In May 1994, Webster bought a new car and began researching the local roads. And on the 27th of May, just 8 months after their wedding day, tragedy struck.
The circumstances on the night were that he enticed his wife to join him on an unnecessary journey from their farmhouse to the city of Aberdeen, some 15, 16 miles away, to drop off some paperwork to do with a project. So that created the reason to have to be in the vehicle at that particular time of night. And she came with him.
We don't know what was going through Webster's mind when he decided to kill Claire Morris, but we do know that he had planned it carefully. He had found a site where he could drive the car into a tree, and he deliberately increased the dose of medication that he gave her.
He gave her sedatives until she was unconscious, and then he carried her to the car, put the seat down so that as he was driving, nobody would be able to see that she was in the car.
One can only imagine at that point that she'd been heavily sedated, because she must have fallen asleep very quickly in the prone position in the passenger seat. So then, at the predetermined location, he drove the vehicle off the road at a very low speed, did impact with a tree with the front of the vehicle.
Webster was not finished. His boyhood fascination with fire, combined with his desire for money, meant that he had one more scene to play out.
And then he simply emptied petrol fuel in the vehicle, set it on fire, and then passers-by effectively intervened. But remarkably, He maintained to at least one, possibly two of the first witnesses who arrived on the scene, because the question was asked, is there anybody else in the vehicle? And he was adamant no.
On 2 occasions he was asked if there was anybody else in the car, and he denied it. And it was only when the thing actually exploded into flames that he said that, oh, my wife's in there.
The man who had so recently promised to love and to cherish Claire now stood and watched while she burnt to death.
I have rarely heard anything more calculating in my life. If she was very lucky, she may have stayed unconscious as a result of those drugs. If she was not, then she died in agony.
What that did to Claire in the car was inhuman. Her skull was welded to the back of the chair at the front. Her bones were welded to the seat. Some wonderful fireman had to do his best to get what was left of her up and into an ambulance. It's vile.
The grieving widower played his part well. He was above suspicion, even to those he was closest to.
Up in Scotland, it's actually male members of the family that carry out the coffin. And me and a few of my cousins were doing that. And it was when they put Claire on my shoulder that I actually cracked. Yeah, the sky had collapsed for me. And I do remember that feeling quite sorry for myself, and then looking up at Malcolm, who was on my right, and thinking, wow, I've lost my sister, but he's lost his wife. And as they lowered Claire into the grave, I had a cord in this hand, which was with several other cords lowering the coffin down, and with this hand I was holding on to Malcolm, squeezing his hand. And I looked up at him, and he was in tears as well.
Now it was time for Webster to cash in, claiming on the insurance policies. He was finally a man of means, but the money didn't last long.
Having accumulated significant wealth and benefited from Claire's death to the sum of well over £200,000, which in the 90s was a significant, this remains a significant amount of money, but he managed to squander that very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Claire's death, he found himself in a situation where he was pretty much empty in the bank.
But Malcolm Webster knew how to get rich quick. He had a formula. Meet, marry, murder.
If he was to analyse how he'd conducted the murder of Claire, it was a perfect plan from its inception through execution. He got away with it, so why wouldn't he do the same again?
Newly single and now stony broke, Malcolm Webster left the UK. It wouldn't be long before he met a young woman, and in 1996 they married.
All I'd heard from Mum was that he got married again. He'd met somebody in Saudi Arabia and he got married again. That's literally all I knew. I didn't know who it was, what nationality she was, or anything like that.
The many faces of Malcolm Webster were on display with a nurse called Felicity Drum. The couple set up home in her native New Zealand. Webster had married. Now he wanted money.
So in the relationship with Felicity, he starts to repeat the pattern, almost exactly the relationship that he had with Claire. He starts giving drugs to Felicity. She starts feeling again vulnerable and tired and fatigued. And after they got married, practically the first day after they got married, he gave her such a huge dose of sedative that she slept for 36 hours.
And so clearly, even in the very, very early stages of their relationship, he was putting his plan into action.
This is a man who didn't just not care for his wife or his wives. This is a man who cared for nobody and had not a shred of compassion for anybody.
When the unsuspecting Felicity became pregnant, the couple moved to Scotland. The pregnancy did little to put Webster off his stride.
Here was a man who was prepared to feed drugs to his wife, knowing, as a nurse, the effects they might have while she was pregnant. He was prepared to continue to feed her drugs, which might well affect the health of their baby once it was born and she was breastfeeding. And while his wife was pregnant, he almost certainly set a fire in their house, planning to kill her and their unborn child.
In the winter of 1998, a fire broke out in the Websters' home. The blaze forced the family's return to New Zealand, where they stayed with Felicity's parents. Malcolm was growing ever more desperate for money. The result? Another fire.
Certainly, during his marriage to Felicity, he had set fire or had laid fires on one occasion with his infant son and his wife and her parents, all asleep in the same house.
Having been living with Felicity's parents, the Websters were keen to move on. They planned to buy a house, but Webster was a worried man. He knew that close scrutiny by Felicity of her bank account would reveal an ugly truth. He'd been stealing. The solution? Kill Felicity.
On the morning that he attempted to murder Felicity, they were going to the bank, they were going to meet with their solicitors. And that was going to unveil the fact that he had no money in the account. He had embezzled money from her account. So he knew that that was not going to be a good meeting. So he was pretty much forced into that journey being the journey where he had to do this.
Webster's carefully laid plan was about to be undone. He had to act.
He starts to say that the steering has gone funny and he can't control it, and the car seems to veer at high speed towards a pole in the road. So it's the passenger side that's heading towards the pole, but Felicity manages to grab the steering wheel and they do come to a halt.
Incredibly, Felicity survives the crash. But just a week later, a family excursion and another attempt to kill his second wife.
To cut a long story short, he'd attempted to kill Felicity in the same way that he did kill Claire. And it was her mobile telephone going off with a call from her father that woke her up out of her stupor.
He's shouting at her to stay in the car, stay in the car. He doesn't want her to get out of the car. He's making his way to the boot where again he has put cans of petrol. And it seems that his intention was that he was going to set fire to the car.
This was a man who didn't just not care for this woman, he didn't care for any woman. Money and insurance policy was more important to him than anything.
The real Malcolm Webster had yet to be uncovered to the outside world. For many, he was simply a loving husband. What mistake would it take to uncover a killer? Malcolm Webster had already killed his first wife and tried to kill his second. For Felicity Drum's family, events simply didn't add up. But the evidence against Webster did.
After the crash, the car gets towed away, it's getting taken to a garage, and Felicity's sister goes to the garage, and the mechanic there tells her that there's nothing wrong with the steering at all.
The petrol cans were found in the rear of the vehicle by Felicity's brother-in-law. There was a cigarette lighter found in the console of the vehicle, which was odd because neither of them smoked. There were scrunched up newspapers, and all of this led them to think that something really suspicious had happened.
At this point, Felicity started putting the pieces together and started to make sense of some of the things that had been happening to her, that she was now seeing in a new light. So she made a statement to the police about her suspicions. And she included in that she hadn't been feeling well. So they tested her hair, and as a result of those tests, they found out that she had been drugged for quite a long period of time.
Malcolm Webster knew the game was up.
Once the house of cards began to tumble in New Zealand, and he realised that the game was up, he had to get out of there. And that's when he returned to the UK and effectively went into phase 3 of his life, if you like.
There was little police in New Zealand could do. They had suspicions, but with insufficient evidence there could be no arrest or extradition application. However, to some, there was little doubt as to Webster's intentions.
The sister, and indeed the local police, believed that Webster had tried to murder Felicity in a staged road traffic accident. But by this time, Malcolm was back in the UK.
Some years later, in 2008, Felicity's sister Jane visited the UK. She was on a course with police officers about domestic abuse. She took the opportunity to talk to one detective.
What Jane wanted to do while she was in the UK was seek out Webster and confront him. And she was angry with him. This was there'd been no justice at all, and she wanted to go and she wanted to confront him.
However, the police officer persuaded her that that was probably not a good idea. But to her credit, the police officer contacted what was then Grampian Police, and I had a conversation with her, and we agreed that we would send detectives down to England to interview Felicity's sister in full.
Police were quickly convinced by what they'd heard, and they launched Operation Field.
The circumstances of the road traffic accident involving Claire, his first wife, were remarkable, and the circumstances in New Zealand involving the road traffic accident with Felicity were remarkable, but when you overlaid and put the two together, they were compellingly striking in terms of the similarities. And so that largely was the catalyst for another wave of investigation, but it needed more than that. It needed something tangible, something solid to actually ignite the second investigation, if you like.
But records from the crash that killed Claire Morris were of little help.
Malcolm Webster effectively carried out the perfect murder because he was never a suspect, because there was never a crime. Had there been a connection that was a crime, he would have very quickly have been in the frame, and very quickly I'm sure the evidence would have been there to support it, because there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, and clearly the toxicology of the post-mortem would have very much been focused on sedatives. But at that time, it was only an alcohol screening that was carried out. The pathologist, Dr. James Grieve, very highly experienced, highly respected gentleman, he did have a meticulous record of what had happened in the original post-mortem.
What the investigation needed was solid evidence, something tangible.
That physical evidence came from another remarkable source, and that was a small piece of liver tissue from the original post-mortem of Claire back in 1994. And with the passage of time and the advance of science, the toxicology around that was remarkable.
They found a way of testing it for unnatural substances, and with this new method they found temazepam in that sample, and that it was a 90-something% chance that it was temazepam, and that is not something that could be naturally in there from the body generating it. It would have to be planted there.
This tiny sliver of liver led to the remarkable outcome for us as investigators that there was indeed clear evidence, scientific evidence, that there was sedative in that liver tissue, which then entirely changed the circumstances of an original road traffic collision, because all the circumstances indicated that somehow Claire must have been incapacitated at the time of the collision, because there was no other way of explaining why she didn't escape from the vehicle herself.
To strengthen their case further, police returned to the collision that had killed Claire Morris.
They said it was an accident. So you think, well, people have accidents, you know, and that was my visualisation of it. He said that he'd swerved to avoid a motorcycle. Unless you're detached from that person and looking at it in the cold light of day, it's very difficult to be suspicious when somebody has, prior to that, gained your trust. But if I'd been a policeman or a fireman or something like that, and I had known Malcolm, then I might have been able to look at it with more constructively critical eyes.
That critical eye was to come from specialist crash scene investigators who focused on the speed of the collision.
Investigators are pretty good at estimating a speed from the damage that's presented on the vehicle. And there's lots of research papers to support that too. So it would be relatively obvious, standing at the scene of this collision, that you were dealing with a low speed impact as opposed to quite a high velocity energy exchange.
Webster had claimed to have swerved to avoid a motorcycle, a story which now appeared flawed.
If you're dealing with an evasive steer, a case where a driver's reacting to a hazard in the road, say an oncoming vehicle or an animal or something like that, you would expect a significant amount of steering to be applied very quickly indeed. It doesn't lose a lot of speed as it's travelling across the road, so it would be slightly unusual to end up with quite a low speed impact at the end of a swerve or an evasive manoeuvre.
Crash investigators now turned their attention to the fire that engulfed Claire's car.
In this case, there were witnesses that described the fire took hold of the vehicle 15 or 20 minutes after the original collision. Whilst fires take a while to propagate through a vehicle, this would be the case when the vehicle is colder than it was at the time of the collision. We also look at that in conjunction with the fact that it was a very low speed impact. We have a low speed impact and a late onset of a fire. That would be very unusual.
Satisfied that Claire's accident was deliberate, the investigation revisited the incident in New Zealand.
Webster's allegation in the second collision was that there was a defect with the steering that caused him to swerve across the road. It's highly unlikely that a defect to any part of the steering system would cause the vehicle to swerve across the road in the way that it did.
As police investigated Malcolm Webster, he was in the Scottish Highlands with a woman called Simone Banerjee, who he'd met in 2004 and who knew nothing of his past or what he had planned.
He had no care for anyone except himself. Every time he met somebody, he was planning to get their money and kill them.
The net was closing in on killer Malcolm Webster. Police working to bring him to justice for the murder and attempted murder of his first two wives. But Webster, once again, is a man with a plan. Engaged to be married, he can't allow his past to catch up with him.
I took a phone call from Webster, who had heard that there was investigations ongoing into the death of Claire. And he was highly indignant. He was pseudo-aggressive in terms of how could you possibly think that I could be involved in anything to do with Claire's death. Very dramatic phone call. Definitely a determined phone call to try and, for whatever reason, convince somebody on the other end of a phone that he wasn't involved in his murder. And it struck me as being somewhat pathetic that somebody might think that they could, in a phone call, just douse down the interest in a murder investigation.
Argyll for Malcolm Webster and his new fiancée Simone Banerjee. Life seemed good. She did not know about his past, or that he had a wife and child in New Zealand. Furthermore, she didn't know of his history of faking illnesses.
We know that he, on several occasions, groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia.
Munchausen syndrome, where people pretend or feign illness, even poison themselves in order to get medical attention, is not unknown. We know that Webster would have been very aware that illness brings with it attention. After all, he had been a nurse.
Planning a honeymoon aboard their yacht, nurse Simone Banerjee could not have imagined her fiancé's cancer was bogus.
And in fact, he went to the extent of apparently going for chemotherapy, and in absence from the family home, he was actually engaging with other women, but he would return home with his head shaven, his eyebrows shaven, apparently as part of his chemotherapy. So that was the extent that he would go to. And again, that pattern of behaviour continued. And again, it was an ingredient in the relationship that he had with the latest lady in Argyll, where, as a nurse, and her friend as a nurse were convinced that he had leukemia.
Police were watching Webster and becoming increasingly concerned for his fiancée's safety.
If you take all of the circumstances of Claire's murder and the staged accident and the death and the insurance payout, and if you take all of the circumstances and ingredients of what he did with Felicity in New Zealand, the staged accident, the insurance, the signing over of the house, the estate, all of the ingredients are there. And when you look at his relationship with the lady Simone in Argyll, again, there was a relationship building with a woman of some wealth. There wasn't the insurance wraparound at that particular point in time, but there was a bequeath, the signing over of a house that was worth £250,000. There was a yacht that was worth a substantial amount of money that he had a half share in. So again, it wouldn't be too difficult to draw some conclusions potentially of what was going to be the outcome.
Malcolm was supposed to be taking her on a boat for several weeks, and it turned out that he'd actually damaged her life jacket. This person was going to kill again.
When it became known that they were about to embark on a fairly lengthy yacht trip around the Canaries, that's when the decision was taken that something had to be done. And so there was an intervention through what we call an Osman warning, where if the police become aware of intelligence that they believe that someone's life is in danger, then you're obliged to advise and notify that individual. You don't have to reveal the source of that suspicion or intelligence or information, but there is a duty of care in terms of advising, and of course that's what was done. Simone was warned that there was a genuine belief that she was in a relationship with a dangerous individual who had a history that would suggest that she needed to think very carefully about continuing that relationship.
Malcolm Webster fled to Surrey, where in February 2009 he was finally arrested and charged with the murder of Claire and the attempted murder of Felicity. Police had a dossier of circumstantial evidence, but could they find something tangible that would reveal the killer's mistake? At his trial, a jury heard about his pyromania.
There are so many incidents of fire that Webster was involved in. 2 houses, one in New Zealand, one in Scotland, went on fire that he was responsible for. Obviously, the tragic fire involving Claire. But beyond that, there were other incidences of fire, even up until months before he was arrested. In the hospital that he was working in Argyll, there was a fire in a dustbin, which he found and doused out and became a bit of a hero. Because undoubtedly Webster needed to be the centre of attention. So the fires were a real feature of Webster's life.
And there were those that were prepared to testify to that.
We randomly got a phone call from a police sergeant in England Kent, Surrey, I think, who had seen the publicity, had recognised Webster and recognised him as a fellow scout when they were 14, 15 years old. And he was compelled to tell us that even in those days, young Webster had a reputation involving fires. So on scout trips, things had gone on fire and Webster was never far away. And that nickname he had, which there's a certain irony in, and the nickname was Pyro.
During the trial, Claire's brother Peter would learn of a much darker side to his brother-in-law.
I mean, one of the things that I asked Derek Ogg, the QC, at the time of the trial was that after the supposed accident, and Malcolm had been picked up by an ambulance and taken to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, they tested his pulse and that was normal. They tested his pupil dilation and that was normal. And I said to Mr. Ogg, how can that be? Because if you've been in a genuine accident, your pulse and everything would be all up anyway because of the shock of what's happened. And if you committed a crime, surely you'd be excited as well. So how could they be normal? And his reply to me was astonishing. He said, Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it. Which I didn't even know people like that existed prior to this. That is something for me which is astonishingly scary.
So what was the cause of his ultimate downfall, the killer's mistake?
He underestimated people. He was very confident of his own intelligence, his own planning. He thought that he had covered all the bases, but actually this wasn't a clever man. This was a manipulative man. But when you look back, most of the things he did were quite clumsy. Things like telling the people who turned up at the accident there was no body in the car. He didn't even think that there would be evidence in his wives' bodies of the drugs that he was giving them. He decided to repeat what he'd done. So one car crash is unusual when it kills somebody. To have two, and then to have a third person who's being drugged. So I think that his arrogance and his overconfidence in himself underpinned all of those clumsy mistakes he made that made it easier for the police, even looking back at these as historic crimes, to prove that he was a liar.
Here we have a man who cares absolutely nothing for anybody and will allow nothing to get in the way of him achieving what he wants. He is a highly calculated man. He's an intelligent man, and he is a man who has become overconfident because he has believed that he has got away with his crime. So here is a man whose life is gradually causing him to have a higher and higher inflated view of his own ability to evade justice.
An arrogant man, but crucially also a greedy one.
Of course, the overriding motive in all of Webster's actions will come back to his greed, his insatiable desire for wealth. I think he lived his life in a complete fantasy, and he was successful in many ways in terms of his goal of making money out of that, until eventually his greed tripped him up.
Webster's mistakes would cost him dear. On the 5th of July 2011, he was sentenced to life and will serve a minimum of 30 years. The judge likened his case to that of a puzzle.
I think it was well described as being like a 1,000-piece jigsaw that was strewn across the floor, and until such time as the jigsaw was put together, not just by the police but by family, by friends, there was a whole network who helped put this jigsaw together, but only then did it become clear that Webster's whole life was predicated on lies, fantasy, wealth-driven plans to take advantage of women, often vulnerable women who fell for him. He was a charmer. He was a quintessential English gentleman.
Yet he felt no remorse for his crimes.
He had no problem with discarding people's lives, and no remorse or regret for doing so.
No, he's never shown remorse. He's never admitted his guilt. He maintains his innocence to this day, but that's not unusual. That's not to be... you wouldn't necessarily be surprised at that, because he probably right now is sitting in a cell in prison, still feeling a little bit hard done by. That's the reality that is Malcolm Webster.